That night, the Soviet Union did not collapse. No tanks rolled through the streets, no flags were torn down, no declaration announced the end of an empire. But inside a room, around a table, the future of the world was quietly abandoned. This was not the night the Soviet Union fell. This was the night everyone accepted that it already had. One day later, the USSR would officially cease to exist, but the real end came earlier, when the men responsible for holding it together stopped pretending it could be saved. This was the night before the dissolution. And this is what was really discussed at the table. In December 1991, the Soviet Union still existed on paper. It still had borders, it still had ministries, it still had an army, nuclear weapons, and a seat on the world stage. But none of that mattered anymore. The system was empty. For years, the Soviet economy had been deteriorating behind statistics that no longer reflected reality. Production targets were met on paper and missed in factories. Shelves were empty, supply chains were broken, trust had collapsed, money existed, but it meant nothing. Authority existed, but it could not enforce itself. The state still spoke, but no one listened. Mikhail Gorbachev understood this better than anyone. He had inherited a system that could not be reformed without unraveling itself. Perestroika was meant to save the Soviet Union by making it flexible. Glasnost was meant to restore legitimacy through transparency. Instead, they exposed the truth. The moment people were allowed to speak, they spoke about failure. The moment regions were allowed autonomy, they demanded independence. The Soviet Union did not break apart violently at first. It leaked. Republic by republic, control slipped away. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine. Each step weakened the center further. By late 1991, the Soviet government still existed, but it no longer governed. Orders were issued and ignored. Laws were passed and unenforced. The center could not collect revenue, control production, or guarantee basic services. The Union was already dead in practice. What remained was denial. Inside the Kremlin, the language changed. Leaders no longer spoke about saving socialism. They spoke about managing collapse, preventing chaos, securing assets, avoiding responsibility. The question was no longer how to preserve the Soviet Union, it was how to survive after it. On December 7th and 8th, 1991, key leaders met away from Moscow. Officially, it was not a historic summit. Unofficially, it was the end. Boris Yeltsin was there. Leonid Kravchuk was there. Stanislav Shushkevich was there. They represented Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Together, they controlled the core of the Soviet Union. What they discussed was not ideology, it was logistics. Who controls the army? Who inherits the debt? Who owns the nuclear weapons? Who pays pensions tomorrow? There was no passion in the room, only exhaustion. But the Soviet Union had not lost a war. It had lost coherence. For decades, the system had relied on centralized control and enforced unity. Once that control weakened, there was nothing underneath to hold the pieces together. The economy could not support independence and union at the same time. Every republic wanted autonomy. None wanted responsibility. At the table, the leaders understood something dangerous. The union could not be fixed because no one was willing to sacrifice for it anymore. The Soviet idea no longer justified the cost of keeping the system alive. Gorbachev was not present. That mattered. The president of the Soviet Union was being bypassed. Power had already moved elsewhere. Decisions were no longer made at the top of the official hierarchy. They were made wherever control still existed, and that control was fragmenting. That night, the conversation shifted from preservation to replacement. If the Soviet Union no longer functioned, what would take its place? How? Could the collapse be framed as transition, not failure? How could responsibility be distributed so no one person carried the blame? These were not revolutionary questions. They were administrative ones. The empire was not being overthrown. It was being dissolved. At the table, the leaders understood that once the decision was made, there was no return. Announcing dissolution would trigger recognition. Recognition would trigger finality. And finality would end any chance of reversal. That night, they crossed the psychological line. The Soviet Union was no longer the future. It was the past. And everyone in the room knew it. At the table, no one spoke about ideology anymore. No one defended socialism. No one quoted Lenin. No one talked about history. They talked about ownership. Who would inherit what once the Soviet Union stopped existing was the real question. Not in theory, but in practice. The state was already failing to function. Factories were idle. The ruble was collapsing. Supply chains were broken beyond repair. What remained was a vast collection of assets without a functioning owner. The leaders in the room understood that if they did not decide quickly, chaos would decide for them. The first issue was power. Not symbolic power, but control. Armies, police forces, intelligence services. The Soviet Union had been held together by institutions that enforced obedience. Those institutions were now fragmented across republics. Who controlled the military units stationed in Ukraine? Who commanded the nuclear forces spread across multiple territories? Who could issue orders that would still be obeyed tomorrow? These were not hypothetical concerns. The Soviet Union possessed the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. A collapsing state with unclear authority over nuclear weapons was a nightmare scenario, not just for those in the room, but for the entire world. The solution discussed was pragmatic, not elegant. Russia would inherit the core. The nuclear command structure, the permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, the central military apparatus. This was framed as continuity, but it was consolidation. Ukraine and Belarus would become independent states, but with carefully negotiated responsibilities. Nuclear weapons on their territory would be transferred. Strategic control would remain centralized. The collapse would be controlled, or at least appear to be. The second issue was debt. The Soviet Union owed billions, foreign loans, trade obligations, state guarantees. The Union had borrowed as a single entity. Now it was dissolving into multiple states. Who would pay? No one wanted full responsibility, but everyone understood that refusing entirely would isolate them internationally. Recognition, aid, and legitimacy depended on appearing responsible. Russia would assume the bulk of the debt. In return, it would claim the majority of the assets, embassies, gold reserves, state property abroad. Again, this was not fairness, it was feasibility. The third issue was legitimacy. How could the end of the Soviet Union be presented without triggering unrest, backlash, or intervention? The language mattered. Words like collapse and failure were avoided. Instead, they spoke of transition, of reorganization, of voluntary dissolution. The Soviet Union would not be declared defeated. It would be declared obsolete. This framing was critical. It allowed leaders to step into new roles without being seen as traitors. It allowed populations to accept change without confronting loss all at once. It allowed the international community to recognize new states without questioning stability. Throughout the discussions, one absence loomed over the table: Gorbachev. The president of the Soviet Union was not invited, not consulted, not included. His authority still existed on paper, but power had already moved beyond him. Including him would have complicated matters. He might have resisted. He might have delayed. He might have tried to preserve the Union in some form. Time was the enemy. Every day the Soviet Union continued to exist increased the risk of uncontrolled collapse, hyperinflation, strikes, mutinies, fragmentation of the security services. The leaders in the room believed they were preventing disaster by accelerating the end. This belief justified everything. At some point, the conversation reached its quiet conclusion. The Soviet Union could not be saved. No reform, no emergency decree, no political maneuver could restore coherence. The system had lost its capacity to enforce unity and inspire sacrifice. The decision was no longer whether to dissolve the Union. It was how to do it with minimal damage. Drafts were prepared. Language was chosen carefully. The document would state that the Soviet Union no longer existed as a subject of international law, that its constituent republics were sovereign states, that a new structure might replace it, but the old one was finished. This was not an act of revolution. It was an act of liquidation. Outside the room, life continued. People queued for bread. Factories limped along. Soldiers waited for orders that never came. The world did not yet know that the Cold War was ending, not with a bang, but with paperwork. The men at the table understood that once the document was signed, history would accelerate, recognition would follow, flags would change, institutions would dissolve. What had taken decades to build would vanish in days. They also understood that there would be no going back. That night, the Soviet Union was still alive legally, but psychologically, it was over. The people who could have saved it had decided not to try. The Union did not collapse because it was destroyed. It collapsed because no one was willing to carry it anymore. At the table, responsibility was being redistributed. So was blame. The end was being framed as necessity rather than choice. When the meeting ended, no one celebrated. There was no relief, only a heavy silence. They had just agreed to dismantle a superpower. One day later, the world would be told that the Soviet Union no longer existed. But the truth is simpler. The Soviet Union ended the moment the men at that table decided it was no longer worth preserving. The next day, the Soviet Union officially ended. Not with sirens, not with gunfire, not with crowds in the streets. It ended with an announcement. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on television. He spoke calmly, carefully. He explained that his position as president of the Soviet Union no longer existed, that the country he had governed was gone. Behind him, the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. There was no resistance, no attempt to stop it, no emergency decree, because there was nothing left to command. Gorbachev's resignation did not cause the collapse. It acknowledged it. At the time he spoke, the Soviet Union had already been dismantled piece by piece. The army was divided. The economy had disintegrated. The republics were acting independently. The presidency had become symbolic. Power had moved away from the center long before the announcement. The Cold War did not end in a victory parade. It ended in silence. For decades, the Soviet system had depended on centralized authority and enforced unity. It demanded sacrifice in exchange for stability and purpose. When belief in that purpose eroded, the system lost its foundation. People did not revolt because they were inspired. They disengaged because they were exhausted. The Soviet economy had reached a point where it could no longer deliver basic expectations. Goods were scarce, inflation surged, wages lost meaning. The promise of security that had justified repression was broken. Once that promise failed, fear was no longer enough to hold the system together. The leaders who dissolved the Union understood this. They did not believe they were destroying a functioning state. They believed they were formalizing reality. The Soviet Union was not overthrown, it was abandoned. This distinction matters. Empires often fall when they are defeated militarily. The Soviet Union fell when its own leadership stopped defending it. Not because they were traitors, but because they no longer believed defense was possible. The system had become too complex, too inefficient, too brittle to survive reform. Every attempt to fix it exposed another weakness. Transparency revealed failure. Decentralization accelerated fragmentation. The tools meant to save the Union had dismantled it. That is the final irony of the Soviet collapse. The Soviet Union did not fall to external pressure. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Military power remained immense. Nuclear weapons were intact, but power without legitimacy is fragile. Authority without trust is temporary. When trust disappeared, so did obedience. The republics did not leave because they hated Moscow. They left because Moscow could no longer provide value. At the table, one day before the dissolution, the leaders accepted a truth they could no longer avoid. The Soviet Union was not worth the cost of maintaining it, and once that calculation was made, history moved quickly. The end of the USSR reshaped the world overnight. Borders shifted, alliances changed, economies collapsed and reformed. Millions of people woke up in new countries without moving an inch. But the most important change was invisible. The idea that a superpower could disappear without a war shattered old assumptions. Strength was no longer measured only by armies and missiles. It was measured by systems, adaptability, and legitimacy. The Soviet Union had power. It did not have flexibility. It could mobilize tanks. It could not reform incentives. It could suppress dissent. It could not generate growth. And when those limitations became undeniable, the leadership chose dissolution over chaos. That choice ended the Cold War, not with a treaty, not with surrender, but with acceptance. The night before the dissolution was not dramatic, it was procedural. Men around a table decided how to divide responsibility, manage risk, and minimize damage. They were not planning the future, they were closing an account. The Soviet Union ended the way it had functioned for decades, through paperwork, through committees, through decisions made behind closed doors. The final collapse did not require violence because the system had already lost the will to defend itself. Empires do not always die screaming. Sometimes they go quietly when no one is willing to carry them anymore. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. It reshaped half the world. It challenged global capitalism. It survived wars, purges, and crises. But it could not survive exhaustion. That is what was discussed at the table one day before. The end. Not ideology, not revolution, not dreams, just limits. And once those limits were accepted, the end became inevitable. The Soviet Union did not collapse on December 26, 1991. It ended the night before, when everyone in the room stopped pretending it could be saved, and the world has never been the same since.